Thank you, Ruth. What I wanted to do was start out by where we've seen very significant progress under the coalition, which is on spending cuts. We've seen quite significant cuts from existing spending plans, although spending will still be rising under the plans announced yesterday. Those have included a 2-year pay freeze, abolition of the Child Trust Fund, cuts in welfare spending, reducing grants to devolved regions, a recruitment freeze, abolition of the RDAs, hopefully, although we've been led up the garden path by the Conservatives on this issue before. Other regional development agencies, other quangos have also been cut back, and there have been other cuts in the business department, all of those building on long-standing TPA recommendations. So we have seen a lot of the work that the TPA and indeed the Institute's directors from a report last September being brought into reality. We're seeing a lot of those cuts coming through. However, there are still a huge range of cuts we've made, and on a lot of areas, we've yet to see the detail, partly because it will be coming through in the comprehensive spending review, but we've also seen huge areas ring-fenced unnecessarily. Now, the public may quite understandably not want to see big cuts in the NHS budget, in the NHS services, but does that mean that it is impossible or not necessary to make cuts in, for example, non-frontline staff in the NHS? I don't think there's any political impossibility there, and I think that with the massive growth in management staff, much faster than, for example, the growth in nursing staff, there is room to make cuts in a lot of the non-frontline departments without running into a wall of political opposition, and that's been the biggest missed opportunity here. And what that's led to is that the coalition, at least in the early years, haven't lived up to their own standard for spending cuts as opposed to tax rises. George Osborne mentioned in his speech yesterday this 80-20 rule for the balance between between spending cuts and tax hikes. Now, we've got the 80-20 rule drawn on that graph, and we've got what was in the plans announced yesterday. And particularly in the early years, the VAT hike is so dominant in this that they don't reach up to that standard. Now, what that means is that all of the logic we heard from George Osborne about the international evidence that that spending cut-dominated fiscal adjustments are more effective, better for growth, more likely to be successful, hasn't been acted on. And it's particularly important because the 2010-11 bits of that graph are what's happening now. The spending cuts are all theoretical. They're all yet to come. And they're all things which haven't been delivered yet. So in terms of what's actually been done by the coalition government so far, they haven't lived up to their own standard of 80-20. The problem with that is that as we've been arguing for a long time, Britain isn't undertaxed. We're coming into this fiscal crisis after a decade of tax hikes, not tax cuts. And therefore, any tax cuts will either hit ordinary families and low earners, and therefore increase benefit dependency, increase poverty, or they will be politically satisfying but economically disastrous and raise very little revenue. And the 50p rate is the classic example of the latter, but we had two key new examples in the budget yesterday. Firstly, the VAT hike dominated the effects on families in the short term in this budget. What it essentially means is that what should have been an inspiring change, taking so many people out of the tax system through increasing the income tax threshold, has instead become a rather inadequate compensation for what's happening on the VAT side. And you can see there in that graph, the key line there is the line with dots on it, which is the net impact. And what that's showing is that even for poor families, you're looking at several £100s being taken out of their budget by what was announced yesterday. And given the clear lack of a mandate, given the clear attempt to rebut any suggestion that their plans involved an increase in VAT during the campaign, we really worry about putting this kind of thing through a mandate, how that will affect public confidence in the democratic system. Finally, capital gains tax, which is an example of a tax, won't raise much revenue, under £1 billion, and yet poses huge risks, huge economic risks. I just wanted to highlight one, people will talk about others later, I'm sure, which is the instability in the tax system. One key principle of a good tax system is that you don't have wild swings up and down over the years. And yet what have we had? If you look towards, that's the graph since the introduction of capital gains tax back in the 60s. And you can see in the last few years we've had the tax, and you have in there, which normally a few key introductions like indexation happening along the way. But in the last few years, you've had, with the introduction of taper relief, the removal of taper relief, the cut in the rates, the hike again in the rates, you can see that this is just based on a non-business asset held for 5 years with inflation at 2% per annum, so that's a notional effective real rate. You can see that that real rate is shooting up and down wildly in recent years. So really we've seen that because there hasn't been the action there needed to be on spending, the balance has been overly towards taxes, and they've had to introduce some taxes which hit ordinary families and some which will do very little for revenue but will cause serious economic harms.